Hey there and welcome back to another Dragon Prince video. And a week or so ago, I made a video addressing Rayla's role in the upcoming season of The Dragon Prince, as well as, well, pretty much complaining that we've gotten a contrived breakup storyline that was done off-screen in a book. So yeah, that was lovely. And so today, I thought I'd continue in that sort of direction and talk a little bit about the future of the franchise and the future of the story, honing in on more of the stuff that we saw come out of Comic-Con. Now, besides the Callum and Rayla story arc, which really was a massive chunk of the episode, we saw another big story element present itself. All of the Viren, Aaravos, and Claudia drama. We learned that Viren's been a rotting corpse for like 2 years, and that Claudia's been in contact with Aaravos, who started coaching her through learning even darker magic, which she in turn used to bring Viren back to life. But the spell isn't permanent, and thus they need to find a way to bring Aaravos to their world and bust him out of his magic prison, so that he can restore Viren fully. Oh, and they're going to receive help from that massive creepy bug thing that Viren was carrying around that let him talk to Aaravos personally. And apparently that thing is also not Aaravos, but someone else. So yeah, I'm not really sure what the hell that thing's going to hatch into, but I'm thinking it's probably something not all that pleasant. But yeah, that thing's apparently going to be the key to helping our two dark wizards find a way to rescue Aaravos, and by doing so, save Viren. And realistically, that's probably going to be the entirety of their arc this season. And if you've watched my Dragon Prince videos before, you'd probably know that I've been pretty certain, even before all this, that Viren does not make it out of this season alive. He's being set up for the big old betrayal by Aaravos. And I felt like this was always pretty clear, simply from his arc across those first few seasons. But then there was that teaser of him being used as a chess piece by Aaravos, and like, come on. There's no chance of him not being betrayed simply from that alone. It pretty much outright tells you that Aaravos views him as a pawn, not as an ally. He's a tool that he's going to use up to its maximum potential, before he completely discards him, as he no longer has any use for him. And look, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they free Aaravos and it turns out Aaravos is actually a pretty chill guy, apart from being evil, and decides that him and Viren and Claudia are going to be best friends forever, and he keeps Viren alive and they all skip off happily into the sunset and conspire to brutally murder Zim and Ezran and the Dragon Queen and Callum and Rayla and basically anyone that stands up to them. And that would be that. Team of villains versus team of heroes. But that doesn't feel like it's very on brand for Aaravos, does it? Mr. Deep, manipulative, sexy voice actually ending up being a good friend? Nah, dude is going to betray them. All roads lead to that ending. And for me, part of that ending has always had Claudia come out of things set up for her own villain storyline. And under that school of thought, after his resurrection, Viren continues being a completely unrepentant turd of a human being, and tries to murder his best friend's children again and just acts like an all-round asshole. And then when Aaravos betrays him, it's almost like a bit of poetic justice, and you recognize that Aaravos is a bad guy. But since he's killing another bad guy, you don't really care, and you just enjoy Viren's comeuppance. And then, following that original school of thought, I figured Claudia would also probably walk a more villainous path, as her whole arc's been about trying to keep her family together, whilst also delving into more and more dark magic, and it's implied she's had to do some pretty nasty shit in order to bring her father back to life. And of course, this kind of thing usually has some sort of cost, whether it's mental or physical. And then on top of that, she's also clearly being manipulated by Aaravos. I mean, he's been talking to her for 2 years. So I figured that this sort of betrayal, mingled with the loss of her father, and mingled with her likely pre-existing instability caused by all her prior traumas, would probably result in her going full Azula from Last Airbender, and having some sort of mental breakdown, clashing with both Aaravos, and indeed with her former friends and her brother. As obviously, in her mind, they've betrayed her as well, and she has nobody left from her perspective. And when Comic-Con rolled around and we got that sneak peek and the episode and all that, I think I sort of held onto that perspective for a little while, and I figured that her boyfriend character was just going to be a blip on the radar, another character to abandon her when she starts getting too dark and just cementing her fall. But then I started thinking a bit more deeply about it. I mean, yes, she does have all the trappings of a future major villain, one that you can somewhat sympathize with and understand where they're coming from, but at the same time, realize that she really does need to go down.
She's crazy and she needs to go down.
But more and more, I see posts and comments talking about how they want her to have a redemption arc, how they want to see her join up with the heroes and have her own Prince Zuko style storyline. And so that's what I really want to talk about now. How realistic is it for this sort of storyline to actually happen? How would it play out going forward? What would the major story beats be? How does Viren tie into this? How does Aaravos tie into things? Callum, Soren, Rayla? How does the story go forward? How can you make it happen whilst also not making it seem forced or railroaded? Is it even possible to do that? I mean, honestly, I don't even know, but the more I think about it, the less certain I am that Claudia is actually going to walk that villain path at all. I mean, yes, I think she'll walk it part of the way, but I don't think she's going to end the show as a villain or die as a villain. And I do think she's probably going to get some form of redemption, both due to her massive popularity, and also simply because popular media really loves the redemption arc. Like, seriously, there are just so many examples of this. And so, despite her seemingly getting darker and darker every season, I wouldn't be surprised to see her actually get positioned as a sort of anti-hero type of character. A character that's both against Aaravos, but also doesn't really see eye to eye with the heroes either. And I think the way that storyline begins is through Viren. Honestly, as I've said many times before, I think Viren's run his race. He no longer really has all that much to offer the story. And I think if I'd been in charge, he would have just stayed dead. He's clearly not going to be the main villain of this second story arc, simply from the title, Mysteries of Aaravos. And a lot of his prior story arcs are pretty much wrapped up. So what remains? He does some evil stuff this season, frees Aaravos and gets betrayed? I mean, I still firmly sit in that school of thought. I think that's probably what's going to happen. And I think he dies for good very soon. They just kind of need somebody to be that principal antagonist until they can unleash our dastardly purple friend. And so whilst I think Viren is going to fill that role somewhat, I also think they're going to push for a little bit of an atonement arc. Not a redemption arc, not a forgiveness arc. After all, he probably still thinks he was right about the coup and invading Zadia, and I feel like it would be very much out of character for him to suddenly think he was wrong. But I do think that he's no longer going to think that the ends justify the means. I think he'll realise that whilst he doesn't think he was wrong, the way in which he went about things was. And thus he comes to see that the same sort of thing is starting to consume his daughter and has alienated him away from his own son. A son who now, realistically, probably views him as the worst sort of monster. And I think this would be the best way for his character to be handled. He no longer trusts in what Aaravos is saying, and he regrets what's happened to his family, and wants to try and help make things right, to atone through healing his family ties. And I feel like that also gives Aaravos a proper reason to put his ass in the dirt. At least, a reason beyond being a two-dimensional, I'm so evil, supervillain type of character. So, they can make the most out of Viren's character whilst he's still there, still keep him as an elf-hating asshole, and yet show that he does legitimately love his kids. After all, he first started walking that dark path with their best interests in mind way back when they were small children. So I think tying that back into his portrayal, whilst also keeping the more negative elements we've seen previously, is probably the best way to go. And I guess, would that make him an anti-villain? Maybe, I don't know. He's still a piece of shit, but his end goal, saving his family, is a noble one. I'm just thinking his methods and opinions on other things are going to be less than desirable. And yeah, then he dies, and we move into the Claudia arc. And the more I think about this, the more I feel that the best way to follow through with her arc would be to go to that halfway point. Keep her from being an outright villain the entire length of the show, after all she's still quite a popular character, and having a character that will likely be suffering from mental instability and trauma as an outright villain probably isn't going to sit well through a modern lens. But that being said, having her just outright jump ship to the hero side doesn't really fit in all that well with her arc either. After all, she was complicit in the plot to murder the princes, perhaps not at first, but there's no way by the end that she didn't realise that if her father won, they would have to die to secure his rule and the New World Order. Plus, she had issues with her brother's supposed betrayal and abandonment, and likely blames Team Zim for a lot of the things that have gone wrong in her life. Similarly, I don't see why the heroes would trust her either. They know she's betrayed them, and tried to kill them. And this was after growing up with her, basically being family. Shit, Claudia would have been to Ezran what Viren was to Harrow. His number one advisor, his high mage. But she turned her back on that to back her usurping, treacherous father. And then she tried to massacre them and their allies in that final battle. Her being sad and alone isn't going to just buy instant trust and forgiveness. It has to be earned. So how does everything play out? Well, for a while, she pretty much has to be Aaravos' puppet. He's the mastermind, and he's dangling the bait of being able to permanently save her father in front of her eyes. And I think this is what's going to drive her in the early stages of this new story arc. The desire to save the family that she still has left. To save her father. And so, I'm thinking she keeps doing some pretty dark shit in pursuit of this goal. And then, they bring Aaravos back, and it's all fine and dandy, but Viren's still disillusioned, and since Aaravos don't got time for that, he disposes of the problem. And of course this pushes Claudia off the proverbial cliff, and I figure this would be her Azula moment, where everything's come crashing down and she keeps spiraling further and further into despair and rage. And yeah, I think at this point, she goes and does her own thing. Maybe fights the villains, probably fights the heroes, fights anybody really hits rock bottom. And since she's done some pretty bad things to our heroes already, I think the only real way for it to make sense for them to accept her is for her to hit that low point and then come back for it and work to atone. So kind of combining Azula's endgame from the third book of Last Airbender with Zuko's arcs during books 2 and 3 as well. And I think this is probably the best way to do it, as 1, it stretches out her storyline throughout the remaining seasons, and 2, it gives her a redemption arc, or an atonement arc, or simply a less evil arc. Because honestly, I don't think people would want or accept a full-on evil Claudia, or at least a permanently evil one. And whilst I don't agree with simply doing what the fans want just because, I actually think it does make sense, and there is room in the story for this sort of narrative. And this is the way to do it in a more realistic way that gels with the character and the story that she's had so far. But then again, if written well, I also think that her just becoming a straight up villain could be quite compelling. But I do think that those sort of characters are much harder to write, and they have a tendency to feel two-dimensional and cartoonish, and often lack in a lot of depth, even if they started off with depth and character development to begin with. It just sort of reverts. So yeah, for the most part, based on the popularity of the character and the direction I see the overall story going, plus the lack of the wildly popular morally grey anti-hero archetype in the show, I do think a redemption/atonement arc is in the cards for both Viren and Claudia, with Claudia's obviously being the more significant of the two, as I doubt Viren's going to be around forever. I mean, I'm not 100% sold on all this, and I'm not sure if it's the right idea or not, but I think it's a very likely possibility. But as always, these are just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of my little theory on how things are going to play out? You agree with me? Disagree? What are your ideas? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.